All right. The next part of the project will be, in fact, getting our seed crystals ready to grow into large single crystals. And to do this, we're going to want to suspend these seed crystals in a saturated solution of the, in our case, potassium aluminum sulfate. And so what we want to do is, the way that we're going to do it, that I'll be showing you today, is we really just want to superglue our seed crystals to something, a fine wire, something fine smooth wire. Something like fishing line is really ideal. This wire I picked up actually at a jewelry, at a hobby shop that's used to make jewelry and necklaces and things like that. So anyway, I'll just go through quickly how I would superglue my crystals. You guys are certainly, this is an area where you're free to experiment and find out what works for you. Okay, so here we have a seed crystal. What you're going to be doing, what we're going to do is apply super glue to one of the faces. So on a crystal, we have very nice, flat, smooth surfaces. These are known as facets or crystal faces. We're going to apply super glue to one face, and then we're going to basically touch the fishing line to the super glue, and in my case I'm going to use something called an accelerator. It's again something you can pick up at a hobby shop, and it just causes the super glue to dry more quickly. I'll go through this. You'll see this sort of probably in fast forward, and here we go. Okay, here are 5 seed crystals glued to the fishing line, and just to point these out, you can see we have a couple very small crystals, some medium-sized crystals that aren't really well formed, and this is the one crystal that had an excellent shape or morphology, and so this is really going to be the crystal we're going to want to use. Now you might ask, well, why did you prepare 5 crystals? Well, when you're trying to grow large single crystals, it's a very delicate balancing act of having the proper solubility of a solution, and if you're undersaturated, it's going to actually dissolve your crystal, and so there is a chance you can lose these crystals, or maybe the glue falls off, right? So you'll want to have some backups just in case. Okay, so now we're going to prepare our growth solution for our single crystal. Basically, we want to prepare a solution which is right at the saturation point. Again, if it's undersaturated, it's going to dissolve any crystal that we put in, and if it's too saturated, much too it's known as supersaturation. If it's too supersaturated, the crystal will a great amount of the material will just powder out, and you won't grow a nice single crystal. And in fact, if that powder falls on your crystal, it's going to make your crystal look a little bit ugly, because you're not going to have a nice single crystal. You're going to have a glob of a lot of smaller crystals. Now, if you recall, in the beginning, I made a nice blue line to mark our starting water level, and that was very close to saturation. Crystallization, once the solution cooled down, we really started growing crystals, and that means that this blue line represents really the amount of water that, very, very close to the saturation point. And again, that's the reason for having a few extra seed crystals, is we'll be able to put them in and sort of test the waters, and if that seed crystal dissolves and disappears, we know we're very undersaturated, and we'll want to get rid of some water. And if the solution crashes out, we'll know we're way too saturated. We'll want to add some water and reheat. And so that's what we're going to do right now. Is, again, remember, make sure you use distilled or deionized water, and we're basically just going to add water to fill it up to the blue line, so we know we've got the right volume, and then we'll transfer everything to our beaker and reheat it. Again, if you've done this, if you've done your seed growth in some other container, you want to you might not necessarily want to directly heat that container. If it's not specialized glassware, it can crack and shatter and basically cause a big mess and ruin the experiment if you're doing this for a competition, because all of your material will now have gone away. Okay, here we go. All of the contents of the seed growth container have been transferred into, again, this Pyrex beaker. We have a stir bar. I've turned on the hot plate and it's stirring, and now we'll just wait for all of these crystals to dissolve so that we get a nice clear solution once again. Okay, well, so we just finished dissolving everything up. You saw that. Watching that stir bar stir always makes me a little dizzy. Anyway, so now we have our solution ready to go. It's still a little bit warm, and as we saw, this warm solution can very easily dissolve the crystals. And so if we were to take our seed crystal and put it in there right now, it would almost certainly dissolve. So we don't want to do that. But while we're waiting for this solution to cool down, I'll go ahead and show you how we're going to mount our seed crystal to get it into that solution. So this is actually not that #1 seed crystal. This is my second largest crystal. Again, because we need to test the waters and make sure that, we don't want to lose our prized crystal in the event that this is undersaturated and we'd see it dissolve. So this is the second largest crystal that I have, and at the end of it I've tied just a normal slip knot. All right, and to suspend it over the water, you can really use anything. Now I recommend using something with edges so that it doesn't roll, and in this case I just have a little plastic knife, and we'll just go ahead and slide the slip knot down, and so now we have our crystal attached to the knife, and you can see it's obviously way too long. We'd want the crystal to be suspended, midway in the solution. And so what we can actually do is just, when the time comes, we'll just be able to basically turn this, right? Just like a spool. There we are. And we can turn this until we get whatever height it is that we want, and we'll be able to add that in the water, and we'll show that just a little bit later. Another important consideration is you'll want to come up with something to be able to cover it, and so I've just taken 2 pieces of cardboard, and that way you'll be able to control the evaporation rate. There's basically 2 ways to grow a crystal. You can either do it by changing the temperature of the solution or evaporation, and if it is possible to create baths to do the temperature reduction, but in our case we're going to grow this crystal primarily by slow evaporation of the solvent, and so we want to be able to cover the beaker to control how quickly the solvent gets released. And finally, just like last time, this is sort of our starting conditions, and we're not really going to be sure exactly, is this going to be saturated, undersaturated, supersaturated, is it going to be really at a nice spot? So what we do want to do is take our old Sharpie marker and make a line on the container so that we know where we are. And so in fact, if we find out that it's undersaturated, we know we can heat this up and boil off some water to reduce the solvent volume, or if we find out where it's super saturated, we'll be able to add water above this line, and this is going to help us sort of find the sweet spot to start our crystal growth. Okay, so it's now an hour or 2 later. The solution has cooled down nicely. We're just barely above room temperature, and so now we'll go ahead and we'll introduce the seed crystal into the growth solution. Again, we tied this and wrapped it around, so this length here is going to sit the crystal very nicely, you know, right towards the top of the solution. And so what we'll do is go ahead and just add it in nicely, and we'll, actually it looks like we should probably wrap it down, you know, unwrap it just a little bit, maybe one more twist here, and there we go. And we'll put this cardboard like so to cover it, and we'll just keep our eye on it over the course of the next few hours and days, and hopefully we'll see the crystal perhaps dissolve just slightly, but then start growing, and then we'll have a decision, and that is, should we just let this crystal keep going, or should we replace it with our good, best quality crystal? But again, it's entirely possible in the next couple hours this thing could dissolve considerably and potentially even fall off of the string, which would be bad. So anyway, we'll check back in a few hours and take a look. Okay, so it's a bit of good news and bad news. The bad news is the first crystal that I had put in there fell off the string and fell to the bottom of the container. You know, I sort of thought that might happen, so I then put our big, good crystal into the solution, and unfortunately overnight the same thing happened. Now, again, so what you can see are two crystals at the bottom of the container. Now the good news is overnight those crystals definitely started growing. So they have increased in size. The problem is there are new crystals forming at the bottom of this beaker, and again, ultimately what we really want is a good single crystal, and so if we have small crystals clumping together, it's not going to be a good single crystal. So we're going to have to go ahead and fish those out, and instead of super gluing it this time, I think I'm going to try tying it with tying the string to the crystal. Okay, here we go. Here are the crystals. They're now tied to the string. They're looking pretty good. And so hopefully we'll do a better job of getting these things to stay on the string. And the purpose of that is, there's just several reasons. One, the crystal can grow over the whole surface of the crystal. If it's sitting on the container, then obviously it can't grow on the underside of the crystal, and you can only grow crystal on the exposed surfaces. Secondly, if something bad does happen, that is, your solution crashes out and you get a bunch of new little crystallites, if your crystal's sitting on the bottom, it's going to get lots of crystals stuck to it, whereas if it's floating in solution, you know, hopefully any crystals that form will, you know, fall off to the sides and not necessarily stick to your crystal. So if it does crash, you can pull your crystal out, reheat the solution, and then, you know, once it cools back down, put it in. So again, the good news here was that the solution didn't really crash out. Our crystals grew a bit overnight, which means it's super saturated. The amount of water means these crystals will grow. But there were a few little tiny extra crystals growing, all right? And so we want to get rid of those, because what we want is a solution in which there is one crystal growing, and that's it, where all of the material will grow onto this one single crystal. So in fact, I'm actually reheating the solution right now to make sure that that all of those little small crystals at the bottom will be fully dissolved and will return to a nice clear solution. And I've also taken care to cover it, because again, we know that the amount of water that's in there is perfect for growing crystals, that when this cools back down to room temperature, a crystal that's in there is going to start growing. So we'll heat this up and let it cool and re-add our crystals and hope we can have it stick to the thread this time. Okay, here we are the next day. Remember I tied the crystals to the strings this time so that they would not, there's no chance of them at least falling off because the glue didn't hold. So, again, here we are the next day, and I'll go ahead and we'll take a look and see what we have. All right, so here's the beaker, and we can go ahead and zoom in here, and there are the crystals. Now, in fact, there was actually, so this is the big crystal, and so you can see it looks pretty nice. It's a single crystal. There are a few little occlusions inside, and in fact there was a little crystallite sitting on the top that I knocked off a few minutes ago. But there's a couple things I just want to point out in the beaker. One is, if we go down to the bottom, what you can see, do you see all those little crystals growing in the bottom? All right, that's a sign that our solution is a bit too saturated, that not all of the material was able to just grow straight onto the crystal. And one of the more dangerous things, at least for our really nice single crystal in this competition, are these crystals. You can see little crystals forming on the surface. Now, the danger here is that these crystals will get bigger and fall onto our crystals, and then we won't have a nice single crystal. But you can see this guy's really growing large, and in fact it's almost completely overgrown the string. That little string that you see sort of circling the crystal, most of that is actually inside the crystal at this point. And that means we definitely don't have to worry about the crystal falling off the string anymore. So I'll probably let it grow another day or so, and then at some point we'll probably take the crystal out, heat up the solution so that all of these crystals get dissolved, right? Because the bigger these crystals get, the less material that's going to wind up on our final crystal that we want to try and get as big as we possibly can. So that's the plan. We'll take a look at this tomorrow and see what the solution looks like, and hopefully none of these crystals on the top of the solution have fallen onto our big crystal, and we'll let this keep going. Here we go. It's been a couple of days now, and I want to just show you the sample and point out a couple of things really quick. Okay, here we go. Here is the beaker, and if we zoom in, you can see that these crystals are really growing nicely. Actually, our secondary small crystal has a very nice shape, but our primary crystal, here it is, there's a couple. You know, it's really got a pretty nice shape. There's some occlusions, but at this point it's growing very, very, very nice and clear. But like I said, I want to point out a couple of things. One thing you can see is there's some crystals growing up on the string above, which will be problematic once this crystal keeps growing. And the other thing to point out here is you can see there's a large amount of crystalline material at the bottom. But for the time being, the crystal is growing. It's certainly adding mass, and you know, we'll probably, and it's a nice single crystal, so we'll probably just let it keep going. And just quickly, I'll point out, you can see my blue lines here. If I get right at the meniscus, you can see that the water level has gone down. And I'll probably put a new blue line to indicate today's water level. At some point, we're going to you know, take these two big crystals out, heat up the solution so that this material can dissolve, because all this material at the bottom is material that's not growing on our crystal, and we want to get that all, hopefully, well, obviously we can't get it all, but we'd love to get a lot of that material onto the crystal. The perfect situation is having, you know, just our single crystal floating in the beaker without a single other crystal growing. Anyway, again, at some point we're going to want to, you know, heat up this solution, you know, take the crystal out, heat up the solution, dissolve all those smaller crystals, and then reintroduce our large crystal once the solution is cooled. But the game with growing crystals is, anytime you go disturbing this thing, there is always a chance you'll lose everything, right? And so if it ain't broke, you know, right now we're not going to try and fix it. We'll let it keep growing for a few more days and just keep our eye on it. Okay, here we are. It is now, we're now 14 days into the experiment, and we'll go ahead and take a look. I'll point out a few things, and you know, again, we'll talk about my reaction and where we go from here. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and take a look in here. You can see the two crystals floating there. They're certainly much larger now, and in fact you can actually see the little crystal kind of riding along right up on top of the string up here of the big crystal. Now, they're growing pretty nicely, they're fairly clear, but I do want to just point out one thing really quick, and that is if we zoom in here, let's
especially on the small crystal, you can see a little bit of banding. You see, right here, you can sort of see these stripes. Now these are on the inside of the crystal. We can see it a little bit on this crystal as well, right? It detracts from the overall clarity of the crystal that we're growing. And again, what we really want to do is grow the nicest, clearest crystal we can possibly grow. All right. So I've just been leaving this in here. You can see the lines. I've been marking the loss of solvent. We've lost about 100 milliliters over the last 10 days or so. And, that's going to be for our specific room with our specific humidity. But basically, these crystals, the fact that we see a little bit of these inclusions in the crystal, that banding, if we try to grow the crystal much faster than that, we'd see a lot more of that banding and our crystals wouldn't look so good. So in fact, our crystals are actually growing at a pretty good rate right now. Any faster and they probably wouldn't look quite as pretty. So we'll let this keep going until either the water level starts to approach our crystal, or if this small crystal gets much larger and begins to come near our nice big crystal, we'll want to do something about it. But for the time being, we're probably just going to go ahead and let this solution keep evaporating and let these crystals keep growing. Okay, here we are. It's now been 3 weeks since I started this, and I'll let you take a look at the crystals so far. You can see they've grown quite large. But we're about to hit the water line. I could lower them down. We can see that one crystallite is, getting closer to the big, the big crystal. But again, we've got a lot of crystalline material at the bottom of the beaker, and all of that is growing, and it's effectively taking away from the maximum size that we could get. Now, this one actually has gotten pretty large. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take these two so this is a dangerous part because you can always blow it all doing stuff like this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these crystals out of the solution, give them a quick rinse off to get any little crystallites off, and then I'm going to add some water. And how much water to add? I'm going to actually weigh out the crystals and see how large they are in terms of their mass, and from there I'll make a guess as to how much water to weigh. Again, if I add too much water, heat everything up, and I drop my big crystal in, it could totally dissolve if I had added too much water. That's again the reason for this second crystal, is I'm going to add that crystal and see. Hopefully, we'll be in the right ballpark. And, if that crystal dissolves a little bit, that's okay. We're going to use that as sort of a little probe or a test to test the saturation of our solution. And again, if that little crystal, we put it in there, it dissolves a little bit, but then it starts growing, we know we're right at the sweet spot, and it's time to add the big crystal. Okay, here we go. It's about a week later. We're now about 4 weeks into the experiment, and here are the crystals. You can see the big crystal over here is a little bit hazy, and my small test crystal actually looks really quite nice. It's quite clear. These angles really don't do it, there we go, don't really do it too much justice. They've put on a pretty good amount of mass, but again, once again, those crystals showed up at the bottom. In an effort to go ahead and make these crystals nice and large, I'm once again going to take these out of solution, add a bit more water, heat it up. Once all these little small crystals dissolve, I'll go ahead and reintroduce the test crystal. And once the test crystal, once I feel confident that crystal won't dissolve, I'll go ahead and reintroduce the large big crystal, and hopefully we'll start getting on our way to the final of the crystal. Okay, here we are a couple days later, and things have gone actually really well this time around. What we're going to see is, so once again, I heated up the solution, I added some water back in, dissolved all those crystals at the bottom, and then reintroduced the small crystal. And when it was sort of slowing down in terms of dissolving a little bit, I went ahead and added the big crystal. And let's take a look and see what we got. And I'll just talk about it real quick. Here we go. There are the two crystals. They look pretty nice. And again, this time it's sort of caught on, and the new growth really looks good. But one thing you'll notice is at the bottom here, there are absolutely no crystals. And the crystals now are sort of growing enough to sustain the amount of a solid that wants to come out of solution. So we're really at a good spot right now. This situation is ideal, and hopefully I got a little over a week to go for our 6-week experiment, and with any luck, I won't touch this thing again until the 6 weeks are complete, and we'll really have some pretty big, nice, large, single crystals. All right, see you in a little bit. Okay, so it's a few days later now, and really the experiment is going great. I have the 2 crystals and still absolutely no other crystals in the container. So you see the bottom still nice and clear, so we just have these 2 crystals. Now, the disadvantage to this is that my smaller, nicer crystal is growing, as is my large crystal. Now it's clear because I don't have crystals at the bottom that these 2 crystals are actually able to fully support all of the mass that's wanting to crystallize out of solution as the solution evaporates. The bad news is that that second crystal is growing, and it's technically taking away from growth that could be gained by my much larger crystal. And so again, I've warned you several times that whenever you touch a solution, you run the risk of destroying your experiment, and I'm going to do that. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull out that smaller crystal in the hopes that the larger crystal can now accommodate all of the alum that wants to come out of solution as a crystal. But if I do this right, if the solution does not crash out, then that big crystal is going to be growing as fast as it possibly can. Hopefully we don't take a hit too bad on the crystal quality, but again, we should really wind up with a pretty nice large crystal. I've got about a little over a week left for my 6-week competition, and we'll see what I turn up. Okay, today's the day. Here we are 6 weeks later. Things have gone pretty well. So here is the crystal, and we can see there's almost not much room left. It's just barely above the bottom of the beaker, and the water level's coming down. So in fact, if this was going to go much longer, I'd probably have to find a new container. For the crystal. But anyway, it's time to pull the crystal out and go weigh it and see what the mass of this crystal is. Looks like things have gone pretty well. Okay, so now we're going to pull the crystal out, and just a couple points here. What we're going to do is pull this guy out and rinse it off again with a little bit of DI water. We want to keep the surface nice and clean, and then we'll pat it off with a fresh paper towel. And voila, there it is. It's pretty big. It's about the size of a golf ball, maybe a little bit larger, and now we'll go check it out and see how much this thing weighs. Okay, so we're pretty much done. You saw me pull the crystal out, and here we go. So here are the final 2 crystals, right? They both grew in the same container. And you can see they look really nice. This top crystal a little bit smaller. This wound up being a little over 11 grams. And then the big crystal on the bottom tipped the scales at 39.4 grams. So almost 40 grams of alum crystallized onto this. And so just another little quick look. You can see it's really pretty nice. A little bit of inclusions, but overall a very, very nice looking crystal, and almost 40 grams. And what you saw, look, I didn't really do anything too special. You saw some of my technique, and I got great results. Started out with 100 grams of material. Look, you can do this too. Good luck, and enjoy any contests you participate in. Grow a big crystal, and I dare you to try and beat me. All right, thanks for watching.